The Keough School is honored to be part of this relaunch event. We have earned a seat at the table today because of the hard work of 4 incredible graduate students who researched one component of the State Resilience Indicator, social cohesion. These 4 graduate students hail from across the globe, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pakistan, Colombia, and the United States. As they will explain, they spent over 12 months conducting research for FFP as part of our flagship research consultancy program known as the Integration Lab. We are proud of their dedication to this project. They worked under the close guidance of the director of one of our institutes, the Pulte Institute, Professor Tracy Kajewski-Correa. It is now my pleasure to introduce Paul Turner, the President and Executive Director of Fund for Peace, who will provide an overview of the State Resilience Index. Paul has had a distinguished career in the peace-building sector. He has been deployed to 45 countries as a diplomat, activist, academic, and researcher. Among other achievements, he helped launch the National Defense University's Center for Complex Operations and the Interagency Civil Response Corps. He's an innovator and an entrepreneur in the field of peace building. Paul, over to you.
Thanks so much, Maura, for the kind introduction. It's been such a pleasure to work with you and the iLab team and the Notre Dame faculty that have supported them over the last year plus that we've had the chance to build that relationship. The Fund for Peace was established about 70 years ago to help understand and reduce the causes of conflict in the world. We do this in 2 complementary ways: by using data-driven methodologies and innovative technology coupled with local laws and wisdom, and working with multiple stakeholders in order to achieve the desired aims. I'm excited to explore with everyone today the benefits of understanding resilience and how it can drive more impactful programming. Before we begin, I wanted to ask everyone to please mute your audio and turn off your video so that we can preserve bandwidth for those who might be joining from places where it might be somewhat constrained. Should you have any questions for the speakers or potentially even each other, please feel free to use the chat function of Zoom, and we will be pulling from that place the questions that we'll be asking each other during the course of the event. So just a little bit on the background of the State Resilience Index as we get going. We're in a challenging time right now. The world is less peaceful today than at any time since the Cold War. However, the responses and tools of decision makers remain somewhat stagnant. Many miscalculations have been made regarding crisis response, and we can look to countries ranging from Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Myanmar, where trillions of dollars have been invested in addressing fragility with little progress in many of these instances, and sometimes significant backsliding. At the Fund for Peace, we believe many of these miscalculations are caused by the lack of insights into resilience. Looking at countries from fragility alone, for example, using our Fragile States Index, means lacking a full understanding of their dynamics. We need insights to know how to respond to the shocks and in what areas to focus our time, efforts, energies, and limited resources. Responses must take that into account and also work with local partners on the ground. This is where we believe the State Resilience Index begins to help fill that gap. A few years ago, the Fund for Peace started to lay the foundation of the State Resilience Index. We hosted multiple roundtables with various experts on resilience. Together, they developed over 190 metrics. They built pillars and sub-pillars that we would later integrate into the index. They conducted field research we conducted field research in India, Brazil, and Ethiopia to test and validate the metrics that we were developing. And finally, we began to build out case studies. Since then, the Fund for Peace developed machine learning, which is used to compile the data from all over the world. This is also with the support of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And the Fund for Peace advanced the SRI with the hopes that when it is complemented with AI, it could be used to create an equitable and sustainable community for all. Our partners in compiling the SRI have included SAS, who helped build out some of the complementary tools, the Georgetown University Center for Women, Peace, and Security, the Alliance for Peace Building, George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the previously mentioned McGovern Foundation, and most recently, Notre Dame. Many features of the State Resilience Index include a dashboard that provides insight into each country and comparisons to other countries, pillars that include civic space, economy, environment, inclusion, individual capabilities, social cohesion, and state capacity, in which, according to our research, social cohesion represents the key component of that index, and each pillar is formed through multiple subpillars. The crisis simulator that I mentioned in passing allows the user to see how shocks and pressures in general or in specific pillars would affect each country based on an effort to comprehensively understand its fragility and resilience. Through these features, the State Resilience Index serves as the data on its strengths and weaknesses of each country, and provides that data to shape and offer an innovative tool for decision makers. With this overview in mind, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Nate Haken, Fund for Peace's Senior Advisor, to share some insights into the index and its latest findings. Nate?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate the introduction, and thank you for the overview about the State Resilience Index. We're super excited to be here with you all today, and really grateful to the Keough School. Muhindo, Sam, Valentina, and Saad were real champions in all the field research they did in Nigeria and Sri Lanka. They were really incredible, and they came up with some amazing findings that would really help us to bolster our social cohesion indicator, which I'm excited to hear their presentation in a couple minutes. So as Paul said, we've been doing the Fragile States Index now for about 20 years. And what we've noticed over the course of those 20 years is that, as he said, the world is becoming more volatile. On the one hand, we do see that certain indicators like mortality and poverty and education and health have been on the whole improving across the globe, but there are a lot of gaps in that improvement, a lot of uneven improvement, such that the more fragile countries are stuck in the fragility trap and are not able to improve, while the rest of the world has been improving. But really, more to the point in regards to this presentation today is that we have noticed that the world is becoming more volatile, such that the shocks that hit, while overall, as I mentioned, a lot of the indicators have been improving over the last 20 years, the shocks are becoming, the frequency and amplitude of the shocks are increasing. And I think we feel that as well. With the onslaught of COVID-19, it presented a weird opportunity where a single shock hit the entire world at the same time. And from a research perspective, that is a very unique opportunity to begin to do testing of various indicators, run regressions, do field research in order to see how different countries performed and why. And so this is the genesis of the State Resilience Index that we've produced. And as Paul said, what we've felt as we were producing the Fragile States Index for the last 20 years is that it was only showing one half of the coin, and that presented certain challenges. Prota, can you go back? I think that if you can go back a number of slides, there, that's perfect. So the Fragile States Index focuses on what's going wrong in countries around the world. And in order to really identify strategic points of entry for intervention, we also needed to know what's working. So that's where the State Resilience Index comes in. By identifying what's working, even in otherwise fragile countries, we begin to identify strategic points of entry for intervention. and driving a positive development narrative, because even fragile countries have certain aspects, certain islands of things that are working, certain islands of resilience. For example, people talk about Somalia as it being one of the most fragile countries in the world, and certainly it is. But what we found in regards to Somalia, for example, is that the innovative use of mobile money, even among the most poor, and in the context of humanitarian disaster, is an incredible innovation that Somalia is on the leading edge of in terms of development opportunities. So even fragile countries have aspects of resilience, or at least relative resilience, that we can identify through an index such as the SRI, so that we can identify these strategic points of entry for intervention. And then lastly, we wanted to have a tool that, as a companion tool to the State Resilience Index, would facilitate forward-looking scenario planning. So enabling dynamic kind of what-if scenarios to test shocks against resilience capabilities. So that's what this tool is, and we're super excited about it, and we're especially, as I mentioned, excited because the first time we launched it, we noticed that the social cohesion pillar was relatively the most weak of the 7 pillars. But now with the input and the contributions of the Keough School and the iLab, I think that that particular pillar is now very strong. So we're very thankful to them. Go ahead, Proda, and go to the next slide. So now that I've kind of articulated why the index is important, let me talk a little bit about what the index measures. So Paul kind of went over this at a high level, and you can see that social cohesion is extremely important. That one we noticed was extremely important because in our research after COVID, we were running a bunch of regressions and doing qualitative field research, and we found that social cohesion was extremely important, even in the case of a health crisis. And countries that had greater social cohesion had less cascading effects of that health crisis across political, security, and social dimensions. So social cohesion is extremely important. It's also the hardest one to measure of the 7, because there are a lot of other data sources and institutions and agencies that are measuring human capital and state capacity and environmental factors. Notre Dame is a leader in that particular area with the MD Gain, for example. But social cohesion is a very, very difficult dimension to measure, and it required quite a lot of critical thinking and field research in order to operationalize that particular one. But overall, what the index measures is these three dimensions, and they are all very important. Some of them appear similar to each other, but they're all different. So, for example, social cohesion is the degree to which communities share trust, mutual support, and a sense of belonging, ultimately enabling collective action and problem solving. That may, on the surface, appear similar to inclusion, but it's different. So inclusion is the extent to which all groups can participate in decision-making and benefit from public good. So it's possible to have strong social cohesion, but poor inclusion, for example. Or it's possible to have poor inclusion, but strong social cohesion, although that's probably less likely than the former. Let me jump down real quick to civic space, because this relates to the first two. So this civic space is the vibrancy of civil society, free media, and open public discourse that allows citizens to organize, innovate, and hold leaders accountable. This is very important in combination with social cohesion and inclusion, because it is very possible to have strong civic space but declining social cohesion. Like the United States is a very good example of that. So we have very good civic space. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of media outlets, a lot of discourse, but with declining social cohesion, those platforms become more and more contentious. So it's very important to have both civic space and social cohesion if you are going to be a resilient society, and not just focus, for example, on civic space at the expense of social cohesion, because that ultimately is problematic. When a shock hits, as we found during COVID, if you don't have both civic space and social cohesion, then you won't be able to muster the political and social capital for collective action. And the civic space ultimately turns into a gladiator's arena. So now the other indicators that we measure are state capacity. That's the ability of public institutions to deliver essential services. Individual capabilities, that's your human capital measure. So, you know, how healthy is the population? How educated is the population in terms of literacy and economic standing? Because when a shock hits, if you have very low human capital, then people are going to ultimately become overly dependent on externalities in order to bounce back from crisis. But the more human capital that exists, the more resilient the society will be. And then the other two, environment and economy. Environment, of course, is the strength of natural resource management, ecosystem health, and adaptive practices that sustain livelihoods and reduce disaster risk. Economy, this is not your macroeconomic performance so much as how sustainable and adaptable is the economic framework. So that when we talk about resilience, what we ultimately, when across all of these 7 dimensions, ultimately what we're looking at is the ability of a country to bounce back from crisis. Because if a country is more resilient, it will recover quicker. Every country in the world, whether you're rich or poor or strong or weak, is going to face a crisis. This happens, and it's happening more and more frequently, as I've noted. Whether we're talking about the financial crisis of 2008 or the food crisis around that time, or we're talking about the migration crisis following the war in Syria, or whether we're talking about COVID, or whether we're talking about everything that's going on in the world today. The shocks are going to hit, whether you're strong or weak, or rich or poor. But if you are resilient, whether you are poor or rich, if you have resilient social and institutional capabilities to manage crisis, then the shock will be less severe when it hits, and it will cascade less. So it won't cascade as much across all the different sectors. A health crisis will be contained within the health sector, for example, and not turn into an economic disaster. If you are resilient, ultimately the bouncing back will happen more quickly. So it'll be a shallower crisis, and it'll be a shorter crisis. And that's what we ultimately are hoping to optimize with the use of the SRIs, to help responders, help stakeholders to be able to identify strategic points of entry for multiplier effects and synergy, so that they will be able to really have a strong return on their investment when it comes to preparedness. And that is what we're trying to achieve. So thank you, Proda. Can you go to the next slide? So I've talked a little bit about why the index is important. I've talked about what the index is measuring. So now very quickly, I'll talk a little bit about what the findings are. And of course, the findings, you know, if you can dig into each one of these countries, you can look at the various indicators and sub-indicators that aggregate to the final scores. But just to give you a high-level overview of what some of the findings were, the most resilient countries that we found in our research this iteration of the index are Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, New Zealand, and Ireland. And the least resilient are countries that are often in the headlines and are suffering conflict and humanitarian crisis, we have Afghanistan, Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, Chad, Sudan, and Syria. Those were the least resilient ones. This is not necessarily surprising to those of you who follow global affairs very closely. It tracks closely with, for example, the Fragile States Index, even though it's measuring different things. So the fact that we're measuring different things in the Fragile States Index from the State Resilience Index, and the fact that there's a high degree of correlation between the two, does not speak to redundancy in the metrics, but what it does speak to is there's a relationship between fragility and resilience that we need to better understand. And so this tool it provides us that opportunity to do that that juxtaposition and that analysis. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Please go to the next slide. So a bit more interesting, perhaps, than just the top and bottom of the index is what has changed. Since we produced the index a couple years ago for the first time, and in comparison to what the index says today, we have seen that the countries that have moved the most for the positive and negative are Myanmar, Afghanistan, Moldova, and Burkina Faso. Myanmar, we have seen a closing of civic space in our index. So Myanmar, in the context of its conflict that it's been going through over the last few years, civic space has closed and the resilience profile of the country has worsened. In Afghanistan, in the wake of the withdrawal of NATO, we've seen similarly a closure of civic space, and we've seen a reduction of inclusion in the country, and so the overall resilience profile has worsened. Moldova, by contrast, with it's going through the process of ascension to the European Union, and there's a lot of policies that are being put in place. And what we've seen in the index is that as a result of some of these policies, there has been improvement in inclusion, social cohesion, and civic space. And so Moldova is one of the most changed, and it's changed in the positive direction, as you can see here. Burkina Faso also is one of the biggest movers, and in this case, it has worsened in the last couple of years due to a closure of civic space, and this is in the context of a situation of elevated violent extremism and coups that have occurred recently in Burkina Faso and also across the Sahel region. So those are the biggest movers. This tells us a little bit, as we produce the index year on year, we'll be able to track countries over time and to identify which indicators are moving quickly or slowly, and begin to think about what implications that might have for planning and preparedness. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there is a strong correlation between the Fragile States Index and the State Resilience Index, as you can see here. So in this case, I plotted the Fragile States Index on the y-axis, and I plotted the State Resilience Index on the x-axis. And you can see that in the scatter plot, all the countries that we're measuring, you can see that very strong correlation from suggesting that countries that are more fragile tend to be less resilient, and countries that are more resilient tend to be less fragile. However, what's really interesting in this is the countries that kind of diverge from that line. That's where you can begin to have some, I think, interesting multidimensional insights. So the four quadrants, as we think about them, are escalation, oscillation, latent, and stability. So countries that have high levels of fragility and low levels of resilience, when a shock hits, it tends towards a dynamic of escalation because there's a vicious cycle that occurs between fragility, between shocks, and between the low levels of resilience. There is this there is this vicious cycle that occurs, and so it tends towards a dynamic of escalation. And we're seeing certainly countries like Yemen or Somalia, countries that are kind of in that quadrant, will be most vulnerable when it comes to shocks. By contrast, on the bottom right, if you have a high resilience and low fragility, there's more of a virtuous cycle that's occurring, so that when a shock hits, it will be shallower and shorter, as I mentioned earlier. So countries like Japan, Japan was struck with a major disaster a number of years ago in one of its power plants, and it was able to recover more quickly than another country might have recovered, for example. So Japan falls in that quadrant. Singapore falls in that quadrant, for example. The other two arguably are the most interesting. So in the top right, those are countries that have relatively higher levels of fragility and relatively higher levels of resilience. So when a shock hits in a country that falls kind of more in that quadrant, it tends more towards a dynamic of oscillation. So a country like Colombia or Russia or Brazil, those are countries that have relatively higher levels of fragility and relatively higher levels of resilience. So when a shock hits, they're able to manage it, but then the shock will be recurrent. So crisis tends to be a little bit more recurrent in countries the farther you get to the top right of this matrix. And then the bottom left, these are countries that generally are not on the radar of anybody because there's relatively lower levels of fragility, so it's not in the headlines. There's no crisis, but they also don't have that much resilience, or they have lower levels of resilience, which means that when a shock hits, it won't have the same ability to respond to crisis, so it will tend to push it more quickly into the upper left quadrant, into a dynamic of escalation. So countries like Oman or Kuwait, these are countries that are not fragile by any means, but they have relatively lower levels of resilience. And there's a great opportunity here for prevention of the humanitarian impacts that will occur when a crisis hits. Because, as I mentioned, whether you're rich or poor or strong or weak, one thing we know about the world is that eventually a shock will hit. We don't necessarily know, for all the forecasting work that we're all doing in this field, at the end of the day, we don't know when the shock is going to happen, but we know that it will at some point. So if you are a country that kind of falls more towards the bottom left quadrant, then there's a great opportunity for stakeholders and government and other institutions to work together to really kind of enhance the resilience profile so that it can move into the stable quadrant, as opposed to when the shock will hit, moving into the escalation quadrant. So this is a way that we use the State Resilience Index as a companion tool to the Fragile States Index, in order to have a fuller picture of the risk profile of a country. Could you go to the next slide, please, Prota? So another way that we use the State Resilience Index as a companion tool to the Fragile States Index is our work with SAS, which is a software company that focuses on advanced analytics and AI solutions. This work we've been doing with them we're really excited about it. Developing a automated scenario planning tool using large language models and quantitative models. So kind of linking the quant with the generative AI of like a ChatGPT, which is really quite unique. Being able to use your quantitative models and then use the outputs of those models, for example, the SRI and the FSI, to inform the construction of a prompt through a prompt generator, and then using those parameters to really build out scenarios, different types of crisis scenarios, and to think about what should be done to address those challenges. So very importantly, it's not a replacement for local knowledge. This again complements experts' input by providing data-driven scenario suggestions as a starting point for discussion. The AI-generated outputs and scenarios are only used for brainstorming, because what we've done, for example, in Nigeria, we were there with the Keough school team in Port Harcourt last year, and we brought everybody together. We had people from the humanitarian sector and development and peace, and we used the CSS, this tool that we developed using the State Resilience Index and the Fragile States Index to kind of see what type of crisis we wanted to be analyzing, because we wanted to focus on a crisis that was particularly salient in the context of the Niger Delta, and they selected catastrophic flooding as a really important example. So we brought everybody together. They sat down for 3 days. They built out their scenarios, and then we ran the AI parameters and prompts, and we developed findings through using AI, building on the quantitative data that we had been developing with the SRI and the FSI. And then we compared what AI said with what the experts were saying, and they were able to refine their scenario. So this is a tool that, again, is not a replacement for local knowledge, but it enables red teaming and brainstorming for response actors. And we're really excited about how it's been working so far. And this is just another example of how the State Resilience Index is used as a companion tool to the Fragile States Index. If you could go to the next slide real quick. And I believe, Prota, there's like a play button you can push if you hover over there, it should be there. So this is a little video. If it doesn't play, that's okay. But there is go down to the lower black down below. If you lower your cursor, there should be a play. It doesn't matter. I'll just tell you what you should be seeing. So basically, this is a screenshot of the tool that we developed with SAS. And what you can do is you can select your country. If you were watching the video, you'd see that there was selecting Nigeria, and then you select your shock, and the shock in this case would be a flood. And then what it does is it goes and it looks at the model, which identifies correlations between the Fragile States Index and over time and the State Resilience Index, in order to see what types of cascading effects or what types of other indicators would be impacted if there was a flood in Nigeria based on the 20-year history of the country. And then it builds out a prompt, and then it generates a scenario output for the user. And so this is just another example, as I mentioned, of a way that we use the State Resilience Index as a companion tool to the Fragile States Index. And if anybody's interested in seeing a demo of how this tool works, be happy to show you at some later point in time. And I think this might be the last slide. Is that right, Prota? Yeah, okay. So basically, in summary, the State Resilience Index, we're really excited about it. We're really thankful to the Keough School for helping us with the social cohesion pillar. As Paul mentioned, it's one of the most important pillars of the 7. So I'm really excited to hear what they're about to say about their research. The tool, we're hoping, and we are using it for improvements in response through systematic thinking, empowering local action, being more forecasting as opposed to diagnostic, with all the attendant caveats and qualifications that go along with that word. Trying to reduce bias in analysis by using empirical data, promoting trust and ownership, and ultimately making it very practical. And that's what the SRI is all about. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to share this with you all. And I'll turn it over now to the next speaker.
All right. Thank you so much for having us today, Nate and FFP, and also really thankful with the Keough School for giving us this opportunity. We're going to, as the team of integration lab from the Keough School of Global Affairs, go over what we did over the summer to really help the Fund for Peace strengthen the social cohesion sub-pillar of the index. Proda, you can go to the next slide. So as an introduction, and all of us will be speaking. So I'm Saad Kamil. I'm a Master of Global Affairs and MBA student at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm majoring in Sustainable Development. I'm originally from Pakistan, and here with me are Sam, Muhindo, and Valentina, all of which will introduce themselves when they start speaking. Next slide, Rhoda. Okay, so to really like put forward some context on what the challenge actually was, the Fund for Peace came to us with a problem of trying to understand how we can again strengthen the social cohesion pillar of the entire index. Just to give an overview of what the social of the SRI itself, as of now, the SRI, as Nate had explained already, is being measured through 7 pillars, which includes inclusion, social cohesion, state capacity, individual capabilities, ecology, civic space, and economy, all of which are very relevant to measure resilience within a country. But the problem that FFP came to us was trying to understand how we can further improve social cohesion. Social cohesion is, as of now, being measured through 3 different sub-pillars, which include social capital, social relations, and confidence in national institutions, all of which have a list of indicators, all through secondary sources. However, the problem that we had in hand was trying to see, number one, are the things that we are measuring, one, reliable? Two, there were already a lot of existing country gaps that existed within within all of these indicators. So trying to understand, are there other sources where we can get this information from? And the third is latency of the data, because World Value Survey, which is one of the sources of the data, is not being updated constantly. And the last thing was trying to see if whatever data is being collected on a country level, it can be or is representative of what happens locally, which then informed our own decision of going into country and conducting some sort of primary research. And coming down to the fourth thing was trying to see if there are any other missing dimensions that we can find through our research within country. Next slide, Rhoda. So to do this, we came up with one a primary research question, which is basically how can the social cohesion pillar of the SRI be improved to capture the complicated dynamics of social relationships it seeks to evaluate, and communicating the reliability of its conceptualization and methodology to its target user audience. And for that, we then also came up with a 4-pronged approach in trying to see, number one, what do we need? That was already identified by FFP. And then going to the step 1, which was validating whatever already was being measured, is it relevant? And then second was trying to see what we have to add, and then giving up informed recommendation to FFP in trying to see what elements we could potentially add or replace within the validated indexes or indicators, and then leaving it up to them on trying to decide how they're going to integrate it within the broader index. Now I'll pass it on to Valentina to talk more about our entire methodology.
Thank you, Saad. So, as Saad mentioned, my name is Valentina, and I'm going to walk you a little bit around like the methodology that we designed. Can we pass please to the next slide? Thank you. So, the whole project duration was around a little bit more than a year. However, we spent the summer like doing the field research that I'm going to explain in a few seconds. So, the research project began with a desk review to understand the core concepts of social cohesion and how has it been like attempted to measure. And as part of the literature review, we constructed a peer index comparison using research-backed social cohesion indexes and scorecards developed by NGOs, think tanks, and also academics. And some of the main findings of this like first attempt to do like the desk review was that all of the indexes consulted included social capital, social relations, and trust in institutions. And a significant number of them, but not all of them, also included the economic dimensions and civil and political participation. This desk review was followed by the development of a questionnaire designed to conduct key informant interviews. And these were aimed to gathering insights from diverse stakeholders with a focus on 5 key objectives or 5 objectives that we designed that were the ones that were ideal to our research design. So the first one was defining social cohesion, basically understand the core elements of societal bonds. The second was to identify the metrics or like different ways to measure social cohesion, including which one should be prioritized. The third objective was to validate the core concepts, and these are like the core concepts that were already included in the SRI, like elements like interpersonal trust, institutional strengths, and confidence in governance. Fourth objective was mapping data sources for gathering like insights on this social cohesion. And the last one was to assess like cohesion or resilience. Basically, we wanted to validate and explore if social cohesion was actually essential to societal resilience or not. And for this, we conducted 48 key informant interviews. These informant interviews were conducted some remotely, but the majority took place during field work in 2 countries, which represented the scope of the project. These 2 countries were Nigeria and Sri Lanka. And we chose them due to the different types of shocks that each one has experienced and the availability of data. We aim to have 1 data-rich country and 1 data-scarce country. Nigeria was our data-rich country in which the Fund for Peace has extensive work and strong partnerships, which allow us to conduct like the research in Abuja and Port Harcourt. And on the other side, Sri Lanka has faced multiple challenges, including natural disasters, conflict, and most recently political crisis. And in this like space, I want to like take the time to thank and like all the organizations that support us in the KR process. Like without their support, these research wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much. And continue with the design. We talked with different stakeholders, and the stakeholder selections were like basically civil society and NGOs representatives, academics, legal experts, journalists, business leaders, and also government officials. After these 48 key informant interviews, we coded and analyzed the transcripts using Atlas TI and developed a codebook focused on validating like the existing indicators of the SRI, while at the same time incorporated like new concepts and indicators identified in the key informant interviews. And together with these codes, we formed the overall codebook, which was used to analyze which indicators play a significant role in the overall index. And now I'm going to pass the word to Sam. He is going to talk to us a little bit about the findings.
Thank you, Valentina. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sam Gadway, one of the researchers here on the Integration Lab team, and I'm going to walk you through this morning some of the validation results that we had from our research over the summer. The top line item that I'll hit you with just at the top of the letter is, by and large, the 3 original sub-pillars that FFP identified as like the bedrock, the foundational bedrock of social cohesion broadly across all the field of expertise that we engaged over the summer, the communities that we talked to and the people that we talked to, they all felt very strongly that these were necessary inclusions to any metric that endeavored to put a number, some kind of evaluated metric on social cohesion as a concept for a national community. Those 3 foundational pillars are social capital, trust in national institutions, and social relations. To give you an idea, social capital refers to sort of interpersonal and institutional trust that exists at a social level within a national community. Trust in national institutions is pretty simple. It's the degree to which the citizens feel confident that the institutions that they share at the national level are performing the functions that they were designed to execute and are providing the services they were designed to provide. And then social relations refer to the degree to which there are these sort of horizontal networks and relationships that exist within the national community between social groups and between individuals. And everyone that we talked to in the anecdotes that we heard, in the responses that we got to the questionnaires that we fielded, all of these three sort of core concepts came up again and again and again. My colleague Muhindo will talk about some of the new things that also came up that ultimately we recommended adding to the new version of the SRI when it's coming out this year. But these three core bedrock principles, like these were broadly felt as something that were necessary to include. For social capital specifically, like people felt that institutional trust, interpersonal trust with members of their community, like these are critical things for there to be basic civic cooperation and resource cooperation and coordination in times of crisis. Trust in national institutions, we found that it's not just the legislature or the national executive or the courts, like the core branches that everybody thinks about when we're talking about governing institutions. But like the thing that came up again and again was the civil bureaucracy, the public face of government services, law enforcement, regulatory regimes that citizens interacted with on a day-to-day basis. Their experience interacting with those institutions very much colored the degree to which they had trust in a broader national system. So, focusing on how some of those civic institutions are also doing, we felt would be very important for this metric to include. One thing I will note that was interesting for us is like there was the dissident voices that we did hear on the importance of social cohesion for resilience. They actually had a really interesting logic. There was a minority of respondents who told us that they didn't really feel that social cohesion as a concept was necessary for resilience, and their internal logic for that was our communities, my village or my community, we have experienced deprivation and crisis and a lack of government services for so long, and sort of been left out on the lam for so long that we have just become resilient ourselves. We're self-reliant. We can take care of ourselves. We take care of our own. And so, these things that we're trying to measure, these things might not necessarily, they're nice to have, but they're not necessarily necessary for resilience. And so this was an argument that we also put to the community of experts that we engage with in Port Harcourt and Abuja and Colombo. And the response to that logic was really interesting. As Nate alluded to earlier in the discussion, there are some crises that there's really nothing that you can do about. They're going to hit you one way or another. A tsunami, you can't redirect a tsunami. As of yet, we can't redirect a cyclone or prevent an earthquake. These are crises that are going to happen, and there's no really real way to avoid them. But the community of experts that we asked about, this relationship between social cohesion and resilience, they said, there are many crises that can strike a national community that either have roots in an absence of some of these qualities, or very much exacerbated by these qualities, being absent in a national community. And they said that, some of these countries that experience these recurrent issues over things like trust in institutions or trust between social groups, especially in diverse polities in terms of ethnicity and religion and social classes. When you don't have these things, sometimes those crises are a whole lot worse. This was something that very much heartened us, that this is something we're kind of on the right track. This is something that's important for resilience. But we also identified a couple of areas that we kind of want to expand the scope, things that we felt were necessary to include in social cohesion. To talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Muhindo from the DRC.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Sam, for the floor. With all that my colleagues have just presented, we were encouraged to see that many of the indicators that were already included in the State Resilience Index were found in all the interviews we had. So we really felt confident that the FFP had built a somewhat strong index. And from the interviews we had and from analyzing the data, we came up with additions that would make this pillar much stronger. Previously, FFP was looking at social cohesion as a measure of social capital, social relations, and confidence in national institutions. So while this is already a good way of approaching the issue and the people validated this, we heard back that issues of social justice are really important in how cohesive the society is. And especially in measuring social cohesion, the degree to which a society is able to seek or strive or fail to achieve social justice is an indication of cohesion in the society. So we think that social justice can be measured through looking at the level of inequality in a society and also the level of political inclusion. Those come to complement the other sub-pillars in the big pillar of social cohesion. And also on confidence in national institutions, the issues of security were really pointed out by all the people we talked to as very important into how the people feel safe and feel protected by the state, helps them to be cohesive and to be more open to their neighbors and to be able to help other people. So we are glad that the new version of the State Resilience Index has been able to incorporate these recommendations of social justice. And we think that with these four sub-pillars, social capital, social relations, confidence in national institutions, and social justice, we have a much fuller approach and measurement to the issue of social cohesion as a standalone pillar. And with that, if my colleague have no addition, I will pass the floor back to Paul.
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. Sam, Saad, Valentina, and Muhindo, I really appreciate your insights as you kind of shared your journey of discovery and the great recommendations that you were able to put forward. We've already got questions coming in through the chat, so thank you to Blair, Nicole, Noor, and others that have started to weigh in. We'll get to those. Before we do, I wanted to ask one quick question to the iLab team, because I know after your really rigorous research, you came forward with a lot of recommendations as to ways that we might be able to strengthen the index. And there was a lot of back and forth as you wrestled with Nate and others to try and figure out how to really fully integrate your findings with what we had in place. I know one of the challenges that surfaced was the issue of really trying to find reliable and consistent data that's available across all the countries where we're trying to find measurements. And so I'd like to ask the team, just how do you feel challenge is it to encounter these data gaps? Are they very common as you look around the world based on your research? And what's your feeling or what's your sense that even though those exist, that often there's some form of a workaround or proxy that are able to substitute maybe for the ideal that's a good enough answer?
So, Paul, thank you for the question. Data gaps, I think, are always going to be a reality when it comes to formulating indexes, especially across countries. But I think when we talk about it posing as a significant challenge, it always depends on what indicator we're talking about. And in this case, we did see that many important indicators, especially from the perspective of Sri Lanka, just missed out on data, which was then not representative of what resilience actually meant within the country. And when we found other proxies, which we believe are always available because there are lots of local entities that are conducting surveys that might be asking very, very similar questions of what an international organization would be offering, agnostic of the fact of how how detailed it is, it might not be following the same methodology, but if the idea is similar and if we have that number, once we integrated it within the SRI, we did see that there was an increase in in state resilience within Sri Lanka versus the number that we had before with data that with the data gaps. And that was again more representative of the conversations that we were having within Sri Lanka as well. Because once we came out of Nigeria and we started our interviews in Sri Lanka, we did see that there was some sort of commonality between those two countries, but on a measurement perspective, Sri Lanka ranked much lower than Nigeria. So yes, data challenges are complex and it depends again what indicator it is, but at the same time, I think, and we believe as a team that there are always other avenues that you can source data from, which will then be more representative of the country has. And if anyone has to add something.
Sure, I'll just add my 2 cents is that you have half the challenge, like the fun of the challenge is trying to figure out, like, you know, when you're talking with this community of experts and they've identified something that they think is important, thinking critically about like, okay, what data could be out there that could maybe get at this? One of the things that came up again and again was the degree to which there was, the degree to which material inequalities that were very clear, stark realities for people living in poverty in both countries had to deal with on a day-to-day basis, how that impacted their trust in national institutions and trust with other members of their society. I mean, both countries, both Nigeria and Sri Lanka, had experienced some extremely challenging economic turmoil, like in the months and weeks and months immediately preceding the day that we got there. And so people had a lot of stories about feeling that their governing institutions were not responsive, that there were corrupt officials in senior positions of power who were largely apathetic to the needs of the people they were governing. And those had real impacts on the degree to which people felt like, they had a stake and a buy-in in their national community. And so thinking there are creative ways of going about doing that. Like if somebody's telling you that, wealth inequality is something that is, deeply important to them about, the degree to which maybe you have trust in your common man. You could look at, how much of the wealth is held by a certain percentage of the population. Like if there's an extreme concentration of wealth in a certain demographic, whether it's a certain community or a certain segment of society, I mean, that is something that we would, instinctively, I think I have a sense that that is something that would, not lend itself to there being a degree of trust between these groups. So it's just thinking creatively about like what people are telling you and, where you might be able to get at measuring what it is that they're talking about.
Yeah, just one more thing on the data. If you're measuring social cohesion in a specific country, it's much easier to find data related to that country. The challenge with the SRI is that this is a global, you want to measure across all countries. And as you go to multiple countries, the mode of collections and the data available becomes sparse as you add more countries together. So there's a case for doing social cohesion for a specific country, but as you go universal, then you start looking for proxy data that can be available universally so that you can compare across different countries and regions. So you lose in depth as you go wide, but as you go wide, of course you lose in depth, but also you have more opportunity to compare and have a universally useful tool. So there are trade-off in going granular and also having a granular view of the index.
Thanks for all those insights. I think they're really helpful, both in helping explaining to some extent kind of your process and also some of the strengths and weaknesses that you have whenever you try and build out a framework or an index or some tool, because you've got the ability hopefully to provide kind of a theoretical lens in which you're trying to see and understand the world around you. But as with everything, the more that you're able to contextualize that tool, the stronger it becomes. We're getting some questions in from the audience that are both methodological and practical. I think if maybe we'll start with the methodologies and then start to drill down. Nate, I'd like to pose, I think, the first set of questions to you, which is about the index itself. So some good critical questions around, does the idea that we have inclusion there kind of muddy the waters a little bit? And that's coming in from Blair, who also was exploring the difference between social capital and social relations across the different components of social cohesion. Would you be able to weigh in with a couple of thoughts to help Blair understand our attempts to portray those distinct yet similar ideas and why they're occurring in different parts across the index?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Blair, for the question. That's a really important and subtle question, and I'm glad you brought it up. So it doesn't necessarily muddy the waters to have political inclusion within the social cohesion pillar and inclusion as a separate dimension. Although it could, if we weren't clear about the distinctions and what we're trying to measure. Uh, so the inclusion pillar in the SRI is really focused more on structural and systemic inclusion. So for example, equitable access to education services, economic opportunities, and things like that. Whereas political inclusion is kind of a proxy for the perception of belonging and legitimacy, which is what we're trying to get at within the social cohesion pillar. So by separating them, we're certainly acknowledging that systems can be inclusive on paper, while social cohesion can still be lacking. So it's just we're trying to get at kind of overlapping ideas, but trying to be careful about how we operationalize the different subcomponents in a way that in the aggregate gets at what each of the pillars is trying to measure. But I think it's a great question, and I'm sure a similar question could be articulated, when you compare and contrast different submetrics across all 7 of the indicators. We were trying to think about as a whole what are the 7 distinct pillars, and then trying to operationalize each one of them. And at the sub pillar level, there may be some overlap, across various metrics. But it is important for us to be pretty thoughtful about how we construct each one of the pillars. And the kinds of questions you're asking is exactly the kinds of questions that we need to continually be asking ourselves as we're developing and fine tuning the tool, as we go forward. Was that the whole question, Paul?
I think so. And please come in through the chat if you've got some follow-ups to any of the responses. Let me take the questions in a little bit of a different direction by responding to Nicole. She had asked, how is it possible to build resilience against the malicious use of AI, and with a particular focus on youth. So again, our index and even with the simulator, we aren't necessarily prescribing set responses. And just as there's some challenges as you apply the index globally, whenever you look at how to tackle the challenges of the ways that AI is being used to manipulate different groups, or even kind of at the national level in some countries, people toward polarization, toward violence. I think there's a lot of different tools that have come online over the last couple of years. Again, I think they give a really strong departure point where there's a need to try and understand what that tool is and how it can be used in a specific circumstance in a particular country. I think as your question really resolved around the focus on youth, there's a real opportunity and a lot of traction being made in the field of peace building globally, with youth really serving kind of at the forefront of technological innovations that are helping tackle a lot of different problems, not just with AI. And so in some ways, I hope that you know, using these words of inclusion, that we can bring youth into that discussion around what the potential for some engagement might be and what that would look like in any particular setting. But some of the tools that you might be aware of is really looking at capacity building around critical thinking, around how do you train society, both in kind of the formal education systems and informally, how do you engage communities to encourage them to build out their skills in critical thinking, often with a particular lens of helping them wrestle with the challenges of digital literacy. I myself have been sucked into a couple of odds and ends of misinformation or photos that I was shocked or horrified by. And so I think it's a real challenge that we need to really slow down and be able to kind of continually refine the tools that we have as individuals and that we're able to share with others. But that's a great question. Next, I'd like to be able to turn to Noor, who is asking a question particularly around the border region between Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, and was curious as to how Fund for Peace could bring forward these ideas of resilience and how that might help the challenges that particular part of the world is facing. Nate, is that something that you'd be able to share?
Yeah, great question. And ultimately, you know, the work that we do at the Fund for Peace is intended. So we're not the end users of our products. Our products are intended to try and provide resources for partners around the world to take them and take ownership of them and to apply them in their work. So we are, you know, we are hoping with this launch to make stakeholders like yourselves to be aware of the tools that we've been producing and are continuing to produce with our various partners, such as iLab at the Keough School and SAS and McGovern Foundation and others, so that you can take ownership of these tools and apply them for your program design and your planning processes. So that's ultimately what this is for. At the moment, the crisis sensitivity simulator is still in its functioning. It's not public yet. We need to figure out how to make it public, but we are using it in our work with our partners. I did for example, as I mentioned, we did a workshop in the Niger Delta. I did a demo in Cairo. I did a demo in Tunis, and we're trying to make it available more publicly as soon as we can. But in terms of the FSI and the SRI, that is there for you to grab and go. And we would encourage you to use the two as companion tools, as I mentioned, where you take fragility and you juxtapose it with resilience, and you can use that to begin to think about, you know, what might be the implications for your programs and projects in your work whether it's the Horn of Africa or anywhere else. We're certainly, you know, eager to hear from you if you have specific questions about how you can use the tools. And we have no pride of authorship here. We want you all to take these tools and run with them. And you know, as you use them, if you have feedback for how effective or if there are gaps, you know, we're very eager to hear from you so that we can continue to refine these tools and make them more useful for people who are at the front lines, like yourselves. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks for the good questions. Again, Jim just saw your note and agree that I think during these times of change, it's going to be important to try and ensure that both kind of long-standing tools that were really being leveraged just by a couple of key users and new tools that are entering the marketplace are are being introduced and being embraced by whatever new structures that may be taking place within the U.S. government, foundations that are coming on the scene, et cetera. And we'll certainly reach out to Maura to see how we might be able to collaborate on some of the good work in Guinea. I want to come to another question for the iLab team that Marco raised that asks about whether or not there's a correlation between social cohesion and religious and spiritual levels in the state.
That is an excellent question. Really good question. I will say in the engagements that we had, because we spoke to actually a fair number of religious leaders as well as part of the community of experts that we engaged. And they brought a really interesting perspective to the discussion about social cohesion. And if I remember correctly, like that community of folks, ministers, religious leaders, like they did feel that, especially at maybe like a lower echelon of community, like in maybe like a village or a town, or even like maybe like a basic, the church community in the city, like religiosity was one of those things that did bring people together. And gave, I guess, people sort of like a foundational lodestone to revolve around and something to return to. And it was really interesting to see in both countries that had experienced a lot of issues, economic issues, and corruption in the government, that those religious communities were the ones that people turned to as like their bedrock. These are the foundational communities that their lives revolved around. The people within those communities are the ones that they trusted. And some of them alluded to that, maybe those bonds of relationships and social trust may be weakened with people who are outside of that community. That would be something that I would say maybe this is something that we want to do like more research on in the future. But I think by and large, like folks in the religious leadership community felt that like having a faith background, having a certain sense of religiosity, like that is something that is beneficial to social cohesion broadly. But as part of a constellation of other issues that are also kind of floating around that a country might be dealing with, like there are ways in which it might negatively impact sort of bonds of social trust. I think, Muhindo, you raised it.
Yes. I would say that when we approached the question, one of the opening question was to ask people, because many people may not know the concept of social cohesion in the community. So we asked people, what is the glue that holds society together? And with that question, what is the glue that holds society together? Religion came every single time as one of the glues that hold society together. But then it was expressed differently by different people, as Sam has alluded to. So people would hold religion as a glue that hold that part of religious believers together. But in some cases, especially in a place like Sri Lanka, religion is seen as the holding one part of society together, but against another part of the society. So it has an incidence to social cohesion as a way where people run to after shocks, after difficulties, and there's a broad community that brings people together. But in some cases, it could also be an exclusion of other groups as religious groups play against each other. So there is really a correlation. So I wouldn't say it's a positive or negative, but there is a relation.
On another note, I would like to add that with some of the religious leaders that we talk, especially in Sri Lanka, they pointed like interfaith initiatives as a way or as a program of social cohesion initiatives and efforts. So that point us that it's something that they are also thinking, and that these interfaith initiatives are part of their process of thought for social cohesion.
I would agree with that a lot. I mean, I think that's very well put. You can't have interfaith platforms if you don't have faith communities, for example. So it's about how the different groups interact, and different types of platforms and social groupings in and of themselves. The social groupings aren't bad or good, but if you don't have the social groupings, you can't have the nodes that connect them and that depolarize society. So I think that's what Valentina said is an excellent point about the importance of faith based organizations, because without faith-based organizations, you can't have interfaith dialogue. And so both of those things are very important.
Thank you, everyone. I think we've still got another 4 questions in the chat and just about 10 minutes left. So if we can try and keep our answers fairly concise, that'd be great. I wanted to come back to you, Nate, with a follow-up from Blair, which was exploring kind of the issues. Let me see if I can get the wording correct, about the difference between social capital and social relations, and if you'd be able to expand on that as it relates to the index.
Thank you, Blair. So social relations is more about the connections themselves. So the ties between individuals or groups. So that's kind of like the social relations, to what extent the people, are positively or negatively disposed towards people who are different from themselves across various types of groupings. Social capital is a bit more the value that arises from those connections. So like mutual support and norms of reciprocity and those kinds of things. So there's a again, similar to your last question, where you've got like a subtle shade of difference between one and the other, and it's how they interact with one another. Looking at what we found with the social cohesion pillar, when we look at the disaggregated data, it is important to look at the whole. Don't look only at one of the metrics, because of the fact that there is that subtle shade of difference between the two sub metrics. It's how it all fits together at the indicator level that is perhaps the most immediately meaningful. But disaggregation you can begin to kind of see where there might be some more targeted entry points that you might be able to do. That's the best I can do for that right now. I can put some more thought into it though, and I can give you a more comprehensive answer if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Nate. I've got another question for the iLab team. So Sam in Nigeria is asking about, with the multitude of challenges that Nigeria is confronting, how do resilience and social cohesion function? I'll maybe just start with a quick lead in and say, I don't know that these descriptors are necessarily functioning. They're attempting to try and explain kind of the dynamics at play within the environment and help us to understand what's taken place. So in Nigeria, the issues that you listed, for example, corruption, that obviously impacts social cohesion to some degree and impacts the overall resilience that exists across the society in Nigeria. But it's not necessarily that resilience is impacting corruption. So resilience is kind of a way to understand all of these moving pieces within the country. And so I'll turn it over to the iLab team just to offer a quick reflection or two about their time in Nigeria, and if they've got any additional insights to offer.
Absolutely. So I would say that one of the things that I'm thinking of, like what the SRI might be able to provide for the user, very similar to like the FSI when it came out years ago. This is a tool that I really foresee like policymakers and people engaged in the front lines of this kind of work to track how improvement and deterioration in some of these important factors sort of evolve over time. Maybe overly looking at like when certain events happen and see like which pillars are impacted the most. I know there's potentially going to be future work integrating AI and being able to maybe run assessments on like if one particular natural disaster or an issue causes an effect to one pillar or a series of sub-pillars, like how might we be able to war game and forecast how that could impact future pillar or other pillars in the system? Maybe to kind of preempt and maybe plan ahead, you know, how might we kind of position resources or position our policy stance to kind of get ahead of an issue before it really starts to, you know, snowball into something that's going to be a lot harder to preempt. And so like a country that's facing a lot of issues, what I would hope is that a tool like the SRI would be able to help policymakers and people in the advocacy space to say, you know, if we are introducing policies to kind of address some of these issues, is there a way for us to measure improvements? Like if we are headed in the right direction, maybe we'd want to see in the SRI metrics moving in a better direction. And so that would be like my initial stab at the an answer to that.
Yeah. I think it's more or less about like just validating concepts that exist within society. So Sam, you talked about like there's nepotism and corruption. The SRI is the beauty of the whole index is that it captures all of this from a very local level and from like a people talking about it, because most of the data is based off of surveys. So I think that brings a lot of what you're talking about is like how does it function. The SRI will help you guide that, and within policymakers, and that's what we hope, is trying to understand more in a more nuanced way rather than just looking at economic indicators and saying that this is a country that's resilient because the GDP is high. There's more to it than just economic indicators, and that's what this offers.
It's nuanced enough to be able to differentiate between something like social cohesion and civic space, where like as Nate alluded to earlier in the conversation, like these are two things that are often talked about sometimes interchangeably, or you know, there's an equivocation in terms, but they can refer to two things that are very different and can move in different directions independently of one another.
Well, thank you, team. I appreciate those insights. We've got two questions that we'll try and move through quickly the last couple of minutes. So we'll turn to Nate to respond to these, and I'll try and wrap us up. So the first is asking about whether we have similar survey questions for various regions, and how do we capture the values and cultures in various countries? And I'll take a quick stab at that, and then Nate can maybe fill in any gaps that I've left. So in the development of the SRI, there was that attempt to issue survey questions, and those were similar from country to country, because what we're trying to do again is find ways that we can understand things at the global level, and then take the indicators that we ended up identifying to help us tell the story of each country and the types of resilience that we're seeing there. In terms of how we capture the values and cultures of those various countries, it was through the types of questions that we ask. And I know that's a little bit vague, but I'm happy if you want to reach back out, we could have a conversation in the days or weeks to come as your time permits to get into some of those details just a little bit more. And then the other question is, has Fund for Peace come up with a reliable model that will help users of the State Resilience Index get answers about aspects of state resilience, make forecasts into the future, or design state building projects? That's a really big question to leave till the very end. And so we'll see if Nate can come up with a pithy response. I think an honest answer is probably a little bit of yes and no, but we'll let Nate take it away and wrap us up.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for the questions. In regards to the former question about how we get at the various local dynamics in different countries and the differences in culture and the differences in context, that was why we did so much field research in the construction of this index. When we were initially constructing the index, we did field research in India, Brazil, and Ethiopia, as Paul said, and then when we realized that the social cohesion pillar, which is probably the most contextualizable of the 7 pillars, that was why we had to go back again into the field and do a deeper dive. So we were so thankful to the Keough School for their willingness to spend a whole summer traipsing around the world and doing all these interviews with all of these local experts and stakeholders in different parts of Nigeria and Sri Lanka in order to kind of see to what extent the index was generalizable and to what extent it was not. And so yes, great question. Very important to recognize that the context is different in every country. The index is just a tool. It's a starting place for discussion. It's not the end of the story. You know, it's supposed to provide kind of a high level framework for appreciative inquiry. You know, when you go into the field and you kind of see to what extent if you're doing a project in the Horn of Africa, for example, I think Noor mentioned, if you're doing a project there, you don't just take the index and then assume that that's the end of the story. No, you use these tools as a starting place for deeper inquiry. So that's that. In terms of the question about modeling and forecasting, this is where we are so excited about what we've been able to accomplish with SAS in regards to the crisis sensitivity simulator that builds off of the SRI and the FSI. And then also, as I mentioned, you know, if you can on a more static kind of level, you can create your little mini models by looking at, say, overall what the FSI says versus what the SRI is saying, and make your scatter plots and see where it falls in the various quadrants, or you can break it out into the various indicators and compare each indicator against the other indicators. Each individual indicators and to kind of see where there are relationships between various dimensions across fragility and resilience. And that enables you to begin to identify these strategic points of entry, recognizing that, you know, if you make assumptions around, you know, the dynamics of escalation versus latency versus oscillation, these are kind of ways you can think about forecasting and modeling for state building purposes. But what we're really excited about is the AI enhancements that we've accomplished. And as Sam was alluding to, we have 20 years of data on fragility, and you know, for each country, and we know that each country has had different trajectories across those 20 years. So in some countries, there may have been a disaster, there may have been a natural disaster that we see over the course of the 20 years tends to have the cascading effects across maybe economic and political dimensions. In another country, you can have the same disaster and it won't be correlated with the same indicators. So what this tool does is it does all the analysis around the correlations between the various fragility indicators for each country, so that you can then trace what the system looks like, and how if you have a shock in one area, how it's likely to impact other areas. And so that's the quantitative piece. But then the AI piece that we've done, that takes that information and then uses that information to generate a very detailed, rich, lengthy prompt that then it gets uploaded to ChatGPT and generates a scenario with tables and such, that you can begin to think about what kinds of communities might be impacted by a particular crisis, how severe might those impacts be, and then if you stipulate the cascading effect because of the quantitative analysis that we've done and use that to build the prompt, you can have you can have some confidence in the result, recognizing that also is not the end of the story. That should be done in parallel to qualitative work, workshops, the same kind of tabletop exercises that are typically done in scenario planning exercises. So we're super excited about using AI very ethically and responsibly to bridge qual and quant, and also to bridge local expertise with desktop knowledge, in order to build out these forecasting models and to suggest what kinds of specific actions should be taken in a particular country in order to build resilience and make it more better positioned to withstand a shock and to bounce back more quickly. One last thing, the easiest thing, I'm going to exaggerate slightly. The easiest thing in the world is to predict where a certain shock might occur. That's not so hard. We can just look back over history and know that, you know, certain countries are in a volcanic zone. They're more likely to experience volcanoes. Certain countries are in flood zones. They're more likely to experience floods. That's not so difficult. What is difficult is to predict when that will occur, how severe it will be when it occurs, and how it will impact the broader ecosystem, the social, economic, political, and security profile of the country. That is hard. So that is what we're trying to achieve with the juxtaposition of the FSI and the SRI, and using using machine learning and AI and LLMs to really build off of the quantitative analysis that we've done in order to really provide something robust for experts, whether you're in the Horn of Africa or anywhere else, to begin to just be a little bit more strategic. You know, when you say that the problem is systemic, you're telling people that they have to prepare for everything, because you have to do everything everywhere all at once, and no one has those kinds of resources. So this kind of a tool enables end users to be a little bit more efficient, a little bit more tactical about how they deploy their limited resources for maximum ROI, in order to be better positioned to withstand shocks and to be more resilient as countries and societies. So I don't know. Hopefully that answers the question. And thank you, Paul, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Nate. It's good to see you excited again. I just, everyone, in case it's a new acronym, so the maximum ROI that Nate was referencing is return on investment for those mitigating or prevention interventions. For those of you who are new to the State Resilience Index, we hope that this has been a good conversation to help you realize that this could be a transformative tool in your work in helping you understand resilience. For those of you who've been exposed to the index previously, I hope you're excited about the new rigor that the iLab team from Notre Dame has brought to our thinking and understanding around social cohesion, and how we have integrated their hard work into our index. I hope that through the stories and the very broad ranging questions that we received, that you're walking away with a sense as to how both the index and its support to other tools can help equip decision makers and stakeholders by providing the data necessary to allocate those resources that Nate was talking about effectively, to respond to looming challenges wisely and build human capacity needed to ultimately have a more peaceful and resilient future. Before we go, I want to express my gratitude and thanks to Maura, Nate, Muhindo, Valentina, Saad, and Sam for sharing their thoughts and expertise with us, especially to Prota, who was the man behind the curtain today, who drove the organization of this entire event. And a special thanks to Fund for Peace's teams, past and present, that have contributed to the development of the State Resilience Index, as well as those in the field who exercised patience and shared their enthusiasm as we explored the value of this tool in workshops and pilots around the world. And again, to our donors for helping bring this to fruition. Again, I hope you enjoyed the overview, the deep dive into the social cohesion and the exchange afterwards. We'll be updating our website with the new data any day. I think we may even have that done today. And we'll certainly have this event posted on YouTube if you'd like to share it with friends or colleagues or others that you think might be interested. Thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it and wish you a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.